August 12th, 1976. A prison guard and his wife were found dead in their Devon cottage, shot execution style while sleeping. The next day, 2 more guards disappeared from their homes. By week's end, 6 people connected to Dartmoor prison had been systematically executed. This wasn't gang violence, wasn't a prison riot spilling into the outside world. It was calculated, methodical elimination of witnesses. The killer? A man who'd spent 15 years inside Dartmoor's walls, watching, documenting, planning, waiting. A man named James Edward Kellaway, convicted armed robber, model prisoner, and the most dangerous man nobody suspected. What the corrupt guards didn't know was that Kellaway wasn't just serving time. He was building a case, recording their brutality, documenting their crimes. And when one honest guard named Thomas Prescott tried to expose the systematic torture happening inside Britain's most notorious prison, the corrupt guards murdered him and his family to keep them silent. So Kellaway decided to silence the guards instead, permanently. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence and corruption based on real events. Dartmoor Prison in Devon, England, in 1976 was not a place of rehabilitation or reform or anything approaching modern concepts of criminal justice. It was a dumping ground for Britain's most dangerous criminals, a Victorian nightmare of granite walls and human suffering and systematic brutality. I was sitting in the geographical and moral centre of 368 square miles of moorland, so bleak and hostile that escape was considered nearly impossible, not because of the walls or the guards, but because even if you managed to get over those walls, the moor itself would kill you long before you reached civilization. The prison had been built in 1809, originally to house French prisoners captured during the Napoleonic Wars, designed specifically to break men's spirits through isolation and harsh conditions in one of the most remote locations in England. By 1976, 167 years later, nothing fundamental had changed except the nationality of the prisoners. The philosophy remained exactly the same as it had been under King George III. Punishment, not rehabilitation. Suffering, not reform. I'd break the men completely so they never commit crimes again. Or if they do, at least they'll fear returning to this place more than they fear death itself. The buildings were massive granite structures quarried from the moor itself, walls 3 feet thick, designed to withstand artillery bombardment during the Napoleonic era, and still standing solid in 1976, likely to stand for another 2 centuries. The main cell blocks, built in various phases between 1809 and 1850, held 600 inmates in conditions that violated every modern standard of human rights, but were grandfathered in under old regulations that nobody in government seemed interested in changing. Cells were 8 feet by 6 feet, one small window with bars so thick a man's fist couldn't fit between them. No heating except residual warmth from pipes that served other parts of the building. No running water except one cold tap that prisoners could access twice daily under supervision. In August, cells were stifling hot, temperatures reaching 85 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, stone walls radiating heat absorbed during the day, men sleeping naked on their bunks, gasping for air. In winter, cells were freezing, temperatures dropping to 40 degrees, ice forming on the inside of windows, breath visible constantly, men wrapped in thin prison-issue blankets, trying not to freeze to death during 14-hour nights. The moorland surrounding the prison was equally hostile, perhaps more so in its own way. Rolling hills covered in heather and bracken and granite tors, those distinctive rock formations thrust up through the landscape like ancient monuments to geological violence, beautiful from a distance, deadly up close. Temperatures could drop to freezing even in August at night, when clear skies allowed heat to radiate away. Bogs that looked like solid ground could swallow a man who stepped wrong, pulling him down into cold black water and peat, drowning him slowly while he struggled. No trees for shelter or shade, the landscape stripped bare centuries ago. No buildings for miles in any direction except the prison itself and the tiny village of Princetown. The nearest substantial town, Tavistock, was 9 miles away, across trackless moor. On foot, even knowing the route, it would take 6 or 7 hours minimum to reach safety. At night, in bad weather, without proper equipment, or the moor was a death sentence. Princetown itself, the village that existed solely to support the prison, was 1 mile from the main gate, population 150 in 1976, consisting mainly of prison staff and their families living in stone cottages built during the Victorian era. The village had 1 pub, the Plume of Feathers, 1 small shop selling basic provisions at inflated prices because everything had to be trucked in from Tavistock or Plymouth, 1 primary school with 30 students, 1 church, Methodist, attended by maybe 20 people on Sundays. It was not a place anyone chose to live. It was a place you ended up because you worked at the prison and couldn't afford to commute daily from somewhere more pleasant. August in Devon, even on Dartmoor, should have been relatively pleasant. Temperatures around 18 degrees Celsius during the day, to cooling to maybe 12 at night. But 1976 was the year of the Great Drought, the hottest summer in British recorded history. Temperatures had hit 32 degrees in London, 28 even in Devon. The moor was bone dry, heather turning brown, peat bogs cracking, streams that usually ran year-round completely dried up for the first time in living memory. Inside Dartmoor prison, the heat was oppressive, unbearable. Men confined in stone cells that became ovens, drinking water rationed because the prison's water supply was running low, tempers short, violence increasing. But the heat wasn't the main problem in Dartmoor in August 1976. The main problem was systematic corruption and brutality by prison guards who knew they were untouchable, who knew that prisoners' complaints would never be believed, who knew that Her Majesty's Prison Service would protect its own, rather than admit that torture was happening inside a British prison. The guard staff at Dartmoor numbered 85 in 1976, responsible for controlling 600 inmates, ratio of roughly 7 prisoners per guard. But those 85 guards weren't a unified group. Like any organization, they had factions, had internal politics, had tensions. The majority, perhaps 60 of the 85, were decent men doing a difficult job under challenging conditions, maintaining order through legitimate means, treating prisoners firmly but fairly within the rules. But a minority, maybe 15 or 20 guards, formed a clique that ran the prison through fear and violence, systematically torturing prisoners, stealing from them, running illegal businesses inside the walls, and silencing anyone who tried to expose them. The leader of this corrupt faction was Senior Officer Malcolm Henry Garrett, 48 years old in 1976, 22 years at Dartmoor, rising through the ranks not through competence, but through brutality and willingness to do things other guards wouldn't do. 6'2", heavily built, running to fat now but still strong enough to hurt someone badly. Red face from years of drinking, veins broken across his nose and cheeks, hands scarred from decades of violence, voice like gravel, accent Devon rural, vocabulary consisting mainly of profanity and threats. He'd been investigated 3 times over 22 years for prisoner abuse. 3 times the investigations had gone nowhere. Witnesses recanting testimony after being threatened. Evidence mysteriously disappearing. Ultimately no charges brought because the prison service protected its own. Garrett's inner circle consisted of 4 other guards who were equally corrupt, equally violent. Derek William Hoskins, 39, 15 years at Dartmoor, specialist in psychological torture, breaking men mentally rather than physically, though he was perfectly willing to do both. Christopher James Sullivan, 42, 18 years service, expert at making violence look like accidents, prisoners falling down stairs, walking into doors, medical staff too intimidated to ask questions. Raymond Peter Wilcox, 35, 10 years at Dartmoor, younger than the others but perhaps the most sadistic, genuinely enjoyed hurting people, would volunteer for punishment details. Thomas Allen Griffiths, 44, 19 years service, the accountant of the group, managed the money from their various illegal enterprises, smuggling contraband into the prison, selling it to inmates at inflated prices, running protection rackets. These 5 men essentially controlled Dartmoor in 1976. The official chain of command, the governor and deputy governor and chief officers, either didn't know what was happening or deliberately looked the other way, because maintaining order took precedence over investigating allegations of abuse. The majority of guards who were honest were either too intimidated to speak up or had learned through bitter experience that reporting corruption accomplished nothing except making your own life miserable. And then there were the prisoners, 600 men, ages ranging from 18 to 75, sentences ranging from 2 years to life, crimes ranging from burglary to murder, containing some of Britain's most dangerous criminals, but also containing men who didn't belong there. Were men who'd been sent to Dartmoor not because they were dangerous, but because they'd caused trouble at other prisons, complained too much, filed too many grievances, needed to be taught a lesson about keeping quiet. James Edward Kellaway was prisoner number D 47382, arrived at Dartmoor in January 1961, aged 28, serving 18 years for armed robbery of a post office in Southampton. Robbery that had netted £4,000, but had involved a shotgun and a post office worker who'd been hit in the head with that shotgun and suffered permanent brain damage, hence the long sentence. By August 1976, Kellaway had served 15 years and 7 months, had 2 years and 5 months remaining before parole eligibility, was now 43 years old, looked older, looked 50 maybe, body worn down by 15 years inside Dartmoor's walls. But James Kellaway was not a typical prisoner. Before his arrest and conviction, he'd been an accountant, qualified chartered accountant working for a firm in Southampton, earning decent money, married with 2 children, respectable middle-class life. The armed robbery had been an act of desperation, driven by gambling debts he couldn't pay, £8,000 owed to men who'd threatened to kill his family if he didn't pay. He'd planned the robbery carefully, had gotten the money, but had been caught because the post office worker had triggered a silent alarm. The judge had given him 18 years, longer than typical for armed robbery, because Kellaway was educated and should have known better, should have found legal solutions to his problems rather than resorting to violence. Prison had changed Kellaway fundamentally. His wife had divorced him in 1963, taken the children, moved away, or refused all contact. He'd lost everything except his intelligence and his ability to observe, to document, to understand systems and find their weaknesses. He'd quickly learned that survival in Dartmoor meant keeping your head down, following rules, not causing trouble. He'd become a model prisoner, worked in the prison library, helped other inmates with legal paperwork, never got into fights, never filed complaints, appeared completely broken, completely rehabilitated. But he was documenting everything. For 15 years, from 1961 to 1976, Kellaway had been keeping detailed notes on guard corruption and brutality. Not physical notes that could be found and confiscated, but mental notes, memorizing names and dates and specific incidents, building a comprehensive record of crimes committed by Garrett and his clique. He'd witnessed dozens of beatings, witnessed guards stealing from prisoners, witnessed the contraband smuggling operation, witnessed guards raping younger inmates, witnessed everything and remembered everything, waiting for an opportunity to use that information. The opportunity came in July 1976 when a new guard started work at Dartmoor. Thomas Richard Prescott, 31 years old, former military police in the British Army, served 8 years, including a tour in Northern Ireland, left the army in 1975 because he'd seen enough violence, wanted a quieter life. Took a job with Her Majesty's Prison Service, assigned to Dartmoor in July 1976, arrived with idealism intact, believing in rehabilitation, believing in treating prisoners with dignity, was believing that the system was fundamentally just and that bad actors could be rooted out through proper channels. Prescott lasted 4 weeks before the reality of Dartmoor destroyed his idealism. He witnessed Garrett and Hoskins beating a prisoner unconscious in a storeroom, witnessed Sullivan throwing a prisoner down a flight of stairs, and then writing in his report that the prisoner had fallen accidentally. Witnessed the contraband operation, guards openly selling cigarettes and alcohol and pornography to inmates at prices 10 times normal retail. He tried reporting it through official channels, filed a written complaint with the Deputy Governor on August 2nd, 1976, documenting 3 specific incidents with dates and times and witness names. The Deputy Governor, a career prison service bureaucrat more interested in his pension than justice, quietly informed Garrett about Prescott's complaint. Garrett's response was immediate and predictable. On August 5th, 1976, Thomas Prescott was told by Garrett to meet him in the prison workshop after the evening count, told it was about work scheduling. Prescott went, alone, unarmed. Garrett and Sullivan were waiting. They beat him unconscious with wooden batons, then strangled him with a leather belt, then dumped his body in a maintenance tunnel beneath the prison where it wouldn't be found for days. But Garrett made a mistake. He didn't know that Prescott had already told his wife everything, had given her copies of his complaint documents, had told her that if anything happened to him, she should take those documents directly to Scotland Yard, not to local Devon police who might be compromised. And he didn't know that James Kellaway had witnessed the murder from a workshop window, had seen Prescott's body being carried into the maintenance tunnel, had understood immediately what had happened and why. Prescott's wife, Margaret Prescott, 29 years old, 2 small children, living in one of the prison service cottages in Princetown, waited 3 days for her husband to come home. When he didn't, when the prison claimed he'd simply stopped showing up for work and they didn't know where he was, she took the documents and drove to London, went to Scotland Yard, demanded to speak to someone about corruption and murder at Dartmoor prison. She never made it home. On August 10th, 1976, Margaret Prescott's car was found at a lay-by on the A30 between London and Devon. Her body was in the boot, strangled. Her 2 children, aged 6 and 4, were found dead in the back seat, also strangled. The documents she'd been carrying were gone. The murders weren't investigated thoroughly. Devon and Cornwall police treated it as a random attack, possibly attempted robbery gone wrong, though nothing was stolen from Margaret's purse or the car. The investigation went nowhere. No arrests, no suspects. The case went cold within weeks. But James Kellaway knew exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Knew that Garrett or someone working for him had followed Margaret to London, had murdered her and her children to silence her, had destroyed the evidence of prison corruption, knew that the system had completely failed, that official channels were useless, that justice through legitimate means was impossible. So Kellaway decided to pursue justice through illegitimate means. Decided that since the system wouldn't punish the guilty, he would do it himself. Decided that Garrett and his clique needed to die. Their families needed to die. Needed to experience the same loss they'd inflicted on Thomas Prescott's family. Kellaway's release date was December 1978, still 2 years and 4 months away. But he was patient, had been patient for 15 years already, could be patient a bit longer. He used those 2 years to plan with the same methodical care he'd used as an accountant, the same attention to detail. He memorized home addresses of all 5 corrupt guards, information available in prison records he had access to working in the library, memorized their schedules, their routines, their families, everything, to build a complete operational plan for eliminating them all within a few days, quickly enough that they wouldn't have time to run or prepare defenses. He was released on December 18th, 1978, served 17 years and 11 months of his 18-year sentence, released on standard parole terms, requiring him to report monthly to a parole officer and maintain employment. He settled in Plymouth, 30 miles from Dartmoor, got a job as a bookkeeper for a small construction company using his accounting credentials, appeared to be rehabilitating successfully. But for 8 months, from December 1978 to August 1979, Kellaway prepared for murder. Acquired weapons, not legally but through criminal contacts he'd made in prison. A .38 revolver, untraceable, stolen years ago and passed through multiple hands. A hunting knife. A length of rope. And basic tools for killing that wouldn't draw attention during purchase. He conducted surveillance, driving to Princetown on weekends, watching the guards' homes, learning their patterns, verifying they still lived where prison records indicated, confirming their families, their routines, their vulnerabilities. And on August 12th, 1979, exactly 3 years after Thomas and Margaret Prescott and their children had been murdered, James Kellaway began his campaign of revenge. His first target was Malcolm Garrett, the ringleader, the man who'd ordered Thomas Prescott's murder. Garrett lived in a stone cottage on the edge of Princetown with his wife, Helen, 46, and his teenage daughter, Susan, 17. Kellaway watched the house for 3 days, learned that Garrett worked a rotating shift pattern, that on certain nights he was home, the other nights he worked late. On August 12th, 1979, Garrett was home, off duty, drinking in front of the television while his wife and daughter were upstairs asleep. Kellaway entered through the back door at 2:30 a.m., lock-picked easily, moved silently through the house he'd studied during surveillance. Found Garrett passed out drunk in his chair. Shot him once in the head with the .38 revolver, suppressed using a makeshift silencer, pillow wrapped around the gun barrel. Garrett died without waking. Kellaway went upstairs, found Helen Garrett asleep, shot her once in the head. She never woke. Found Susan Garrett asleep in the next room. Stood there for 30 seconds, .38 revolver pointed at a 17-year-old girl who'd done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong father. That this was the moment Kellaway's plan required him to murder an innocent. He pulled the trigger. Susan Garrett died in her sleep. Kellaway left through the back door, drove back to Plymouth, went to work the next morning, attended his regular parole meeting that afternoon, appeared completely normal. The bodies were discovered on August 13th, when Malcolm Garrett failed to report for his shift. Prison officials sent someone to check on him. Found 3 bodies, all shot execution style, no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no obvious motive except Garrett's occupation. Devon and Cornwall police investigated, but had no leads. No witnesses, no forensics. Kellaway had worn gloves and left no trace. The murder weapon would never be found. The investigation stalled. On August 14th, now Derek Hoskins and his wife Patricia were found dead in their home in Princetown, both shot while sleeping. Same method, same execution, same lack of evidence. On August 15th, Christopher Sullivan disappeared from his home. His body was found 3 days later in a bog on the moor, throat cut, partially submerged. On August 16th, Raymond Wilcox was found dead in his car parked outside the Plume of Feathers pub, shot through the window while sitting in the driver's seat. By August 18th, 4 guards and 2 wives were dead. Devon and Cornwall police finally connected the cases, realized this was systematic elimination of Dartmoor prison guards. Thomas Griffiths, the 5th member of Garrett's clique, was placed under protective custody, moved to a safe house in Exeter under 24-hour police guard. It didn't matter. On August 23rd, de Kellaway found the safe house, entered through a bathroom window the police guards hadn't secured properly, shot Griffiths and his wife in their bedroom, left before the guards realized what had happened. 6 victims, all connected to the corrupt clique at Dartmoor, all murdered within 11 days. The investigation intensified. Scotland Yard sent a team. Former Dartmoor prisoners were interviewed. Prison records were examined. And eventually, inevitably, investigators found James Kellaway's name. Found that he'd been released 8 months earlier. Found that he'd witnessed Thomas Prescott's murder. Found that he had motive, means, opportunity. Kellaway was arrested on September 3rd, 1979, at his workplace in Plymouth. Found the .38 revolver hidden in his apartment. Found notes documenting the guards' home addresses and schedules. Found everything needed for conviction. He didn't resist arrest, didn't deny anything. Confessed immediately, calmly, methodically. Explained exactly why he'd killed them, what they'd done to Thomas Prescott, what they'd done to Margaret and her children. Expressed no remorse, said he'd do it again given the chance. The trial began in February 1980 at Exeter Crown Court, lasted 3 months. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: ballistics, timeline, motive, confession. The defense argued diminished responsibility. 17 years of prison abuse had driven Kellaway insane. The jury didn't buy it. James Edward Kellaway was convicted on 6 counts of murder in May 1980, sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 40 years before parole eligibility. Sent back to prison. Not Dartmoor. Somewhere else. And somewhere they thought was more secure. He escaped in 1983, was never recaptured. Some say he died on the run. Others say he's still out there, living under a different name, watching for more corrupt guards who need silencing. This is Dark Chronicles UK. Subscribe for more stories they tried to bury. And remember, in Britain's prisons, sometimes justice wears a prison uniform and carries a .38 revolver. The investigation that eventually led to James Kellaway's arrest was one of the largest manhunts in Devon's history, involving over 200 police officers, dozens of detectives from Scotland Yard's murder squad, forensic teams, psychologists, profilers, and eventually cooperation from prison services across England. But in those first chaotic days after Malcolm Garrett's body was discovered on August 13th, 1979, nobody suspected a former prisoner. Nobody imagined that a man released from Dartmoor 8 months earlier would have the capability, the patience, the sheer cold-blooded determination to plan and execute a campaign of revenge that would claim 6 lives in 11 days. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Thornton of Devon and Cornwall Police arrived at the Garrett cottage in Princetown at 8:45 a.m. on August 13th, 45 minutes after the bodies were discovered by a prison administrator who'd been sent to check on Garrett when he failed to report for his 7 a.m. shift. Thornton was 52 years old, 28 years with Devon and Cornwall police, seen everything from drownings to farm accidents to domestic murders, thought he was beyond being shocked by violent death. But walking through that cottage, seeing Malcolm Garrett slumped in his chair with half his head missing, seeing Helen Garrett in her bed with a bullet hole in her temple, seeing 17-year-old Susan Garrett dead in her childhood bedroom surrounded by posters of pop stars and school certificates, Thornton felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't a domestic dispute, wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was execution. The scene told a clear story to Thornton's experienced eyes. As the killer had entered through the back door, the lock picked cleanly using professional tools, no damage to the frame or handle. Had moved through the house silently, knew the layout somehow, went straight to Garrett in the living room first. Single shot to the head, close range, using a pillow or similar material as a makeshift suppressor, because neighbors 30 yards away heard nothing. Then upstairs, 2 more executions, both victims shot while sleeping. Both killed instantly. Neither had time to wake or struggle. Then the killer left the same way he'd entered, back door, into the darkness of Dartmoor night. No witnesses, no forensics except the bullets, which ballistics would later determine were .38 caliber, fired from a revolver that was old, probably from the 1950s or 60s, barrel worn, rifling degraded, making precise matching impossible. The motive seemed obvious to Thornton. Malcolm Garrett was a prison guard at Dartmoor, one of the toughest assignments in Her Majesty's prison service, dealing with Britain's most dangerous criminals every day. Prison guards made enemies. Prisoners served their sentences, got released, sometimes carried grudges, sometimes acted on those grudges. This looked like revenge, pure and simple. Some former prisoner Garrett had treated harshly, had decided to even the score. But why the wife? Why the daughter? Thornton had seen revenge killings before, had seen former prisoners murder guards, but they targeted the guards themselves, not families. Killing Helen and Susan Garrett served no purpose except cruelty, except sending a message. You hurt someone I cared about, so I hurt everyone you care about. As the second murder on August 14th confirmed Thornton's theory that this was systematic targeting of Dartmoor guards. Derek Hoskins and his wife Patricia, found dead in their Princetown cottage by a neighbor who'd come by to borrow sugar, noticed the front door was ajar, called out, got no answer, went inside, found horror. Same method as the Garrett murders. Back door lock picked, both victims shot while sleeping, single shots to the head. No noise, no struggle, no witnesses. The killer was a ghost, moving through Princetown at night, selecting targets with precision, executing them efficiently, disappearing without trace. Thornton requested assistance from Scotland Yard that same day, August 14th, knowing this was beyond Devon and Cornwall police's resources. To 2 guards and 3 family members dead in 2 days suggested a pattern that would continue, suggested a killer with a list, suggested that more murders were coming unless they stopped him quickly. Scotland Yard sent Detective Chief Superintendent William Hargreaves, 56 years old, head of their murder squad, veteran of hundreds of investigations, specialist in serial killings, though that term wasn't commonly used in Britain in 1979. Hargreaves arrived in Princetown on August 15th, set up a mobile incident room in the village hall, began coordinating what was now a major investigation. His first action was to interview the governor of Dartmoor Prison, Roger Pemberton, 58, career prison service administrator who'd been governor since 1973, who initially resisted cooperating fully, cited prisoner confidentiality, our institutional reputation concerns, worried about negative publicity. Hargreaves threatened to obtain court orders and make the investigation very public unless Pemberton cooperated voluntarily. Pemberton folded, provided access to all prison records, all guard personnel files, agreed to allow interviews with current and former inmates. The pattern Hargreaves identified was clear and damning. Malcolm Garrett, Derek Hoskins, Christopher Sullivan, Raymond Wilcox, Thomas Griffiths. These 5 guards had worked together at Dartmoor for years, had formed a clique, had all been subjects of previous investigations into prisoner abuse, investigations that had gone nowhere, been swept under bureaucratic carpets. Hargreaves read complaint files dating back to 1962, dozens of allegations of beatings, theft, sexual abuse, torture. Read investigation reports that concluded no wrongdoing, despite overwhelming evidence. Understood immediately that institutional corruption had protected these guards for decades, had allowed them to brutalize prisoners with impunity. And Hargreaves understood that whoever was killing these guards had intimate knowledge of their crimes, was motivated by more than simple revenge for harsh treatment. This was justice, from someone's perspective. This was someone who'd witnessed the corruption, documented it, waited years for an opportunity to act. Christopher Sullivan's body was found on August 18th by a hiker walking the moor, partially submerged in a bog 3 miles from Princetown. Throat cut, dead approximately 3 days based on decomposition. Sullivan had been reported missing by his wife on August 15th, when he failed to return from work. Hargreaves theorized the killer had abducted him from the prison or from his car, taken him onto the moor, executed him there. The bog location was chosen deliberately. Bodies sank in bogs, could disappear completely if left long enough. The killer had probably intended Sullivan's body to never be found, but hadn't weighted it properly. Raymond Wilcox was killed on August 16th outside the Plume of Feathers pub in Princetown, shot through the car window while sitting in the driver's seat at 11:45 p.m., just after the pub closed. Wilcox had been drinking, was sitting in his car for a few minutes before driving home. Vulnerable. The killer approached from behind, fired once through the driver's side window, walked away into darkness. At one witness, a drunk leaving the pub, heard the gunshot, saw a figure walking quickly toward the edge of the village, couldn't provide useful description. Male, average height, dark clothing, might have been young or old. Witness wasn't sure. By August 18th, 4 guards were dead. 2 wives were dead. Thomas Griffiths, the 5th and final member of Garrett's clique, was terrified, requested protective custody, was placed in a safe house in Exeter, 35 miles from Princetown, under 24-hour armed police guard. 2 officers outside the house in a car, 2 officers inside, orders to let nobody approach, to shoot if necessary. Hargreaves assured Griffiths he was safe, that the killer couldn't possibly find him, that this was the most secure location in Devon. Hargreaves was wrong. On August 23rd at 3:15 a.m., James Kellaway entered the safe house through a bathroom window on the 2nd floor that the police guards had secured with a simple latch, easily forced open from outside using a screwdriver. Kellaway climbed a drain pipe, forced the window, entered the bathroom, moved silently through the house while 4 armed police officers sat downstairs drinking tea and playing cards. Found Thomas and Caroline Griffiths asleep in their bedroom. Shot both. 2 quick shots, suppressed using a pillow. Left the same way he'd entered, down the drain pipe, into a stolen car he'd parked 2 streets away, drove back to Plymouth, was at work 8 hours later, acting completely normal. The police guards didn't discover the murders until 7 a.m., when they went upstairs to wake Griffiths for breakfast. Found 2 bodies, or realized the killer had been in the house while they were on duty, had murdered 2 people under police protection, had made Devon and Cornwall police look incompetent. The embarrassment was massive. The press had a field day. Headlines screamed, "Dartmoor revenge killer strikes again," and police powerless to stop prison murder spree. 6 dead. The killer was escalating, becoming bolder. Hargreaves knew they needed to catch him quickly before he killed again or disappeared completely. He ordered a comprehensive review of all former Dartmoor prisoners released in the past 2 years, focusing on those who'd served long sentences, who'd had conflicts with the 5 murdered guards, who had the intelligence and capability to plan and execute such a sophisticated revenge campaign. The list contained 347 names initially, and too many to investigate quickly. Hargreaves narrowed it using additional criteria. Prisoners who'd been model inmates, never caused trouble, wouldn't have drawn attention. Prisoners with previous careers requiring intelligence and planning skills, accountants, lawyers, engineers. Prisoners released to the Devon area, close enough to conduct surveillance on Princetown. The list dropped to 23 names. James Edward Kellaway's name was number 7 on that list. Released December 18th, 1978. Served 17 years, 11 months for armed robbery. Former accountant, model prisoner. Currently living in Plymouth, working as bookkeeper. No parole violations, appeared completely rehabilitated. But when Hargreaves read Kellaway's prison file more carefully, read the notes from guards over 17 years, he found something interesting. The multiple notations that Kellaway worked in the prison library, had access to prison records, had helped other inmates with legal paperwork, was intelligent, observant, quiet. And one note from 1976, written by a guard named William Price, who'd since retired. Kellaway witnessed an incident in workshop involving S.O. Garrett and Officer Sullivan. Interviewed Kellaway, who claims saw nothing, seemed nervous. Possible he knows more than stating, but too frightened to speak. Hargreaves pulled the incident report from July 1976. Found a complaint filed by a guard named Thomas Prescott about corruption and brutality by Garrett, Hoskins, Sullivan, Wilcox, and Griffiths. Found that Prescott had disappeared on August 5, 1976, presumed to have quit and left the area, no formal investigation. Had found that Prescott's wife and children had been murdered on August 10, 1976. Case unsolved, treated as random crime. Hargreaves understood immediately. Thomas Prescott had tried to expose the corrupt guards, had been murdered for it. His wife and children had been murdered to destroy evidence. Kellaway had witnessed something, knew something, had waited 3 years and then systematically eliminated everyone responsible. On September 3, 1979, at 8:30 a.m., Hargreaves led a team of 12 officers to arrest James Kellaway at his workplace in Plymouth. Found him at his desk doing bookkeeping, calm, unsurprised when armed officers surrounded him. He stood up, raised his hands, said, "I've been expecting you." Didn't resist, didn't ask for a lawyer. Confessed immediately. They took Kellaway to Exeter Police Station, put him in an interview room, read him his rights, offered him a solicitor. He declined. Said he wanted to explain everything. Wanted people to understand why he'd done what he'd done. Detective Chief Superintendent Hargreaves sat across from him with a tape recorder running and listened to a confession that would last 7 hours, one of the most detailed and chilling confessions in British criminal history. Kellaway started at the beginning. Described arriving at Dartmoor in January 1961, young man of 28, terrified, knowing Dartmoor's reputation. Described learning quickly that survival meant keeping your head down, following rules, never complaining. Described witnessing his first beating by Malcolm Garrett in March 1961, a prisoner named David something. Kellaway couldn't remember the surname. Beaten unconscious in a storeroom for the crime of talking back to Garrett during cell inspection. Described how other guards walked past, heard the screams, did nothing. Described 15 years of systematic brutality, beatings that happened weekly, sometimes daily, guards stealing from prisoners, taking money sent by families, taking food from care packages, selling it back at inflated prices, guards running contraband operations, smuggling in cigarettes, alcohol, pornography, drugs even, selling them to desperate inmates at prices that took months of prison wages to afford. Guards raping younger inmates, particularly those in for sex offences who couldn't complain because who believes a rapist who says he was raped? Described specific incidents with dates and details that Hargreaves cross-referenced against prison records and found accurate. Described Thomas Prescott's arrival in July 1976, described recognizing immediately that Prescott was different, was decent, had integrity. Described watching Prescott's idealism die over 4 weeks as he witnessed what Dartmoor really was. Described seeing Prescott file his complaint, seeing the fear in his face, knowing what would happen. Described witnessing Prescott's murder on August 5, 1976, from a workshop window. Saw Garrett and Sullivan lead Prescott into a storeroom. Heard the sounds of beating, muffled through thick walls. Saw them carry Prescott's body, wrapped in canvas, into the maintenance tunnel system beneath the prison. Knew they'd killed him. Knew nobody would investigate properly. Knew Prescott's complaint would disappear. Described learning about Margaret Prescott and her children's murders from a newspaper in the prison library a week later. Described the moment he decided that official justice was impossible, that the system was completely corrupted, that the only solution was direct action. Described spending the next 2 years planning, memorizing details, preparing mentally for what he'd have to do. Described his release in December 1978, the feeling of stepping through Dartmoor's main gate as a free man after 17 years, 11 months, knowing he'd be back inside eventually, but not as a prisoner, as a visitor delivering justice. Described 8 months of preparation, acquiring weapons through contacts he'd made inside, former inmates who'd been released earlier, who were willing to help because they'd been victimized by the same guards, who provided the .38 revolver and ammunition, no questions asked. Described conducting surveillance on Princetown, learning the guards' routines, their home addresses, their families. Described the internal debate about whether to kill the wives and children. Described ultimately deciding that yes, they had to die, because Garrett and his clique had murdered Thomas Prescott's wife and children, because justice meant equal punishment, because anything less would be incomplete. Described each murder in methodical detail. Entering the Garrett cottage on August 12th. The feeling of putting the gun against Malcolm Garrett's head while he snored in his chair, drunk, helpless. The satisfaction of pulling the trigger, seeing Garrett's head explode, knowing one of Thomas Prescott's killers was dead. Going upstairs. Shooting Helen Garrett while she slept. Standing in Susan Garrett's doorway for 30 seconds, debating whether to spare her, ultimately deciding no, she had to die too. Pulling the trigger, watching a 17-year-old girl's life end in an instant. Described feeling nothing. No guilt. No remorse. Just cold satisfaction that the plan was working, that justice was being delivered 1 bullet at a time. Described the Hoskins murders, the Sullivan abduction and killing on the moor, the Wilcox shooting outside the pub. Described finding the safe house in Exeter where Thomas Griffiths was hiding, conducting surveillance for 3 days. Realizing the police guards were incompetent, the bathroom window wasn't properly secured. Described climbing the drainpipe at 3 a.m., now forcing the window, moving through the house, while armed police sat downstairs oblivious, shooting Thomas and Caroline Griffiths, climbing back down, driving away. Described returning to work the next day, attending his parole meeting, acting completely normal while knowing 6 people were dead by his hand, knowing more police were looking for him every day, knowing eventually they'd figure it out, but he'd completed his mission, delivered justice for Thomas Prescott and his family. Hargreaves asked why Kellaway hadn't fled after the murders, why he'd stayed in Plymouth, continued working, maintained his routine. Kellaway said he'd considered fleeing but decided against it because fleeing implied guilt, implied that what he'd done was wrong. He didn't believe it was wrong. He believed it was justice. He wanted to be caught eventually. Now wanted a trial, wanted to explain publicly why those guards had deserved to die, wanted to expose the corruption at Dartmoor that had been covered up for decades. The confession ended at 4:15 p.m. on September 3rd, 1979. 7 hours of detailed admission of 6 murders, premeditated, methodical, completely without remorse. Hargreaves charged Kellaway formally with 6 counts of murder. Kellaway was remanded in custody at Exeter Prison pending trial. The trial began on February 18th, 1980, at Exeter Crown Court, one of the most publicised trials in Devon's history. Media from across Britain descended on Exeter. The public gallery was packed every day, with people who'd travelled from all over the country to watch. The case divided public opinion sharply. No, some saw Kellaway as a murderer who'd killed innocent women and a teenage girl to satisfy a revenge fantasy. Others saw him as a vigilante hero who'd delivered justice that the system had failed to provide, who'd eliminated corrupt prison guards, who'd brutalized inmates for decades with impunity. The prosecution was led by Sir Malcolm Waterford, QC, 58 years old, one of Britain's most successful prosecutors, brought in specifically for this high-profile case. Waterford's strategy was straightforward. Ignore the allegations of prison corruption, focus solely on the murders themselves, on the premeditation, on the fact that Kellaway had killed 6 people, including 3 women who'd committed no crimes. The issue wasn't whether Malcolm Garrett and the other guards were corrupt, Waterford argued, or the issue was whether James Kellaway had the right to execute them and their families. The answer was obviously no. Britain had laws, had courts, had legal processes for dealing with corrupt officials. Taking the law into your own hands, becoming judge, jury, and executioner, was murder regardless of the victim's character. The defense was led by Jonathan Hartley, QC, 52, specialist in diminished responsibility defenses, argued that Kellaway wasn't fully responsible for his actions because 17 years of systematic abuse and torture at Dartmoor had damaged him psychologically, had created a mental state where revenge seemed not just justified, but necessary for survival. Hartley called psychiatrists who testified that Kellaway exhibited symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, though that diagnosis wasn't formally recognized in Britain in 1980. Called former Dartmoor prisoners who testified to the brutality of Garrett's clique, describing beatings and torture and rape, corroborating everything Kellaway had claimed. But Hartley's defense was fundamentally undermined by Kellaway himself. When he testified in his own defense on March 3, 1980, Kellaway refused to claim diminished responsibility, refused to claim he'd been mentally impaired or traumatized. He stated clearly, calmly, that he'd been completely sane when he planned and executed the murders, that he'd made a conscious choice to deliver justice through violence because all legal avenues had been exhausted, that he believed his actions were morally justified, even if legally criminal. The jury deliberated for 6 hours on March 15th, 1980. They returned guilty verdicts on all 6 counts of murder. Mr. Justice Pemberton sentenced Kellaway to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years before parole eligibility, one of the longest minimum terms ever imposed in Britain at that time. Kellaway showed no emotion when sentence was passed, was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, transported to H.M. Prison Long Larton in Worcestershire, high-security facility for dangerous prisoners. But the story didn't end there. The trial had exposed Dartmoor's corruption in excruciating detail. The media had reported every piece of testimony from former prisoners describing abuse. Public pressure built for a formal inquiry into Her Majesty's Prison Service's failure to investigate repeated allegations of guard brutality at Dartmoor over decades. In June 1980, the Home Secretary announced a full public inquiry into Dartmoor Prison, led by Sir James Thornton, retired High Court judge, with full powers to compel testimony and examine documents. The inquiry lasted 18 months, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, examined thousands of pages of prison records. The final report, published in December 1981, was damning. Found systematic corruption at Dartmoor from at least 1955 onward. Found that Garrett's clique had brutalized prisoners for decades. Found that senior prison administrators, including multiple governors, had known about the abuse and either ignored it or actively covered it up to avoid negative publicity. The report resulted in the forced early retirement of 23 prison administrators, the dismissal of 11 guards, criminal charges against 3 guards for assault and theft. Resulted in sweeping reforms of Her Majesty's Prison Service's complaint and investigation procedures, creating independent oversight mechanisms that still exist today. But for James Kellaway, the reforms came too late. He served 3 years at Long Larton, model prisoner again, worked in the prison library, helped other inmates with legal paperwork, never caused trouble. And on August 23rd, 1983, exactly 4 years after he'd murdered Thomas Griffiths, Kellaway escaped. The escape was sophisticated, carefully planned, executed with the same precision as his murders. Kellaway had befriended a guard over 3 years, had gradually turned him, using a combination of manipulation and money sent from supporters on the outside who saw Kellaway as a hero. The guard, John Williams, 34, wore smuggled civilian clothes and money into the prison, hidden in a food delivery. On August 23rd, during a supervised work detail in the prison grounds, Kellaway changed into the civilian clothes in a maintenance shed, walked out of the prison disguised as a contractor, met Williams outside the prison gates, was driven to Birmingham, disappeared into Britain's urban landscape. Williams was arrested 2 days later, confessed, was sentenced to 7 years for aiding escape. But Kellaway was gone. Massive manhunt involving thousands of officers, roadblocks, searches, media appeals. Nothing worked. James Kellaway had vanished completely. Some believe he died shortly after escaping, possibly killed by associates who feared he'd draw too much police attention. Others believe he fled Britain entirely, possibly to Ireland or continental Europe, to start a new life under a false identity. A few conspiracy theorists believe he's still in Britain, living quietly under an assumed name, possibly still delivering justice to corrupt officials who escape legal punishment. The truth is, nobody knows. James Edward Kellaway hasn't been seen since August 23rd, 1983, 43 years ago. He'd be 91 years old now if still alive. Most likely he's dead, passed away decades ago from natural causes or violence, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. But occasionally, when a corrupt official dies under suspicious circumstances, when someone who escaped justice suddenly meets an untimely end, people whisper the name Kellaway, wondering if the Dartmoor Avenger is still out there, still working, still delivering justice one bullet at a time. Dartmoor Prison still operates today. To houses about 640 inmates, still considered one of Britain's toughest prisons. But it's changed fundamentally since 1979. Independent inspections, prisoner advocates, complaint procedures that actually work, body cameras on guards. The days of Malcolm Garrett and his clique, of unchecked brutality and systematic torture, are gone, ended partially by reforms, but mostly by fear, by the knowledge that somewhere out there might be another James Kellaway, another patient, methodical man who's watching, documenting, waiting for an opportunity to deliver justice that the system won't provide. Thomas Prescott's body was never found. The maintenance tunnels beneath Dartmoor are extensive, unexplored, partially flooded. His wife Margaret and children David and Emma are buried in Princetown Cemetery. The 3 headstones that read simply their names and dates, no mention of how they died or why. Just stone markers for 3 innocent victims of a corruption that the system should have stopped decades earlier. This is Dark Chronicles UK, where we tell the stories Britain tried to erase. Subscribe for more cases of justice delivered outside the law. And remember, in a system where corruption is protected and whistleblowers are silenced, sometimes justice wears a prison uniform and carries a .38 revolver and escapes into history, leaving only questions and 6 graves and reforms that came too late for the men who needed them most.